Education about Anti-Semitism on College Campuses. I'm Yael Aronoff. I'm the director of the Michael E. Lane Serling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel at Michigan State University. I also have the Serling Chair in Israel Studies, and I'm a professor of international relations at James Madison College, who's written about the political psychology of Israeli prime ministers and continued change in political culture. I want to also introduce my colleagues and friends, Kirsten Vermeglish, who's a professor of history and Jewish studies at Michigan State University. Her most recent book, A Rosenberg by Any Other Name, A History of Jewish Name Changing in America, which was published by NYU in 2018, was awarded the Saul Wiener Book Prize for the American Jewish Historical Society in June 2019. And she was one of the lead writers, along with myself, Ariana Metzel, and Amy Simon, of the MSU Guide on Anti-Semitism. And she's currently researching the history of anti-Semitism in the federal government. And Professor Amy Simon holds the William and Audrey Farber Family Chair in Holocaust Studies and European Jewish History at Michigan State University. Her work on Holocaust fiction, memoir, diaries, and pedagogy has appeared in Holocaust Studies, a Journal of Culture and History, Jewish Historical Studies, and the Journal of Jewish Identities, as well as several edited volumes. Her book, Emotions and Yiddish Ghetto Diaries, Encountering Persecutors and Questioning Humanity, is forthcoming in June 2023. Before we, I thank our co-sponsors and so forth, and we all introduce our esteemed panelists for today. One of the reasons we're holding this panel is we've been working diligently for the past 6 years on education about anti-Semitism on our own campus. So Kirsten and Amy do this in their own classes as well, but we do a lot outside the class. So we spent a year with input from others writing a guide on anti-Semitism for the MSU community with examples from MSU. We hold a lot of trainings of hundreds of residential advisors at MSU. We hold lots of workshops, and we've been working closely with Muslim studies, and Kirsten and Amy with others have developed curriculum for MSU dialogues on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia that are now our conversations about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. And so we've been very active on our campus, but want to learn from all of you on your campuses and what you're doing and get additional insights. Before we get started, I wanted to thank Professor Lauren Harris, who's with us today. He's a member of the Serling Institute Advisory Board, and he established the Jonathan Netanyahu Fund for the Study of Jewish People and Anti-Semitism in our institute in 2011. And since then, we've had dozens of speakers on all kinds of subjects in the last dozen years. And just recently, in the past few years, we've also had on subjects and dealing with anti-Semitism, Eric Ward, Saba Sumek, David Nirenberg, Carrie Nelson, Sarah Horowitz, David Hirsch, and Susie Linfield, among many others, speaking to us about issues of anti-Semitism. So thank you, Lauren, for allowing us to do this. And I wanted to thank all of our co-sponsors across the university. They include the College of Arts and Letters, James Madison College, the Residential College of Arts and Humanities, the College of Social Science, International Studies and Programs, Office for Institutional Diversity and Inclusion, Gender in a Global Context, the Department of History, and the Center for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. So I think that with that, Kirsten and Amy are going to introduce a couple of the panelists, and then I'll introduce a third, and we'll get started with some of our questions. We're going to pose 4 questions to our panelists, who will answer those, respond to each other. We might have some follow-ups, and then at 8 p.m., we're going to open it up for your questions in the audience. So please write them down in the Q&A, and then I'll moderate that for the last half hour. And very quickly, too, if you like to know more about the Serling Institute upcoming events, you can have information about that that'll be in the chat, including our website. If you're a student who's interested in learning more about the Jewish Studies minor, we'll have, you can contact me and we'll have information about that. And David Traub also is sponsoring a conference on anti-Semitism and law, and that's going to be in the chat as well. So who's doing our first introduction? Yeah.
All right, well, I'm pleased to introduce Ethan Katz, who I've known for a while now, and I'm just so excited that he's here and we've been able to see one another again multiple times, even on an unpleasant subject. Ethan Katz is associate professor in the Department of History and the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of California-Berkeley. He is a historian of modern Europe and the Mediterranean with specialties in modern Jewish history and the history of modern France and its empire. His major publications include The Burdens of Brotherhood, Jews and Muslims from North Africa to France, which was published by Harvard in 2015 and the winner of a number of honors, including the National Jewish Book Award. Secularism in Question, Jews and Judaism in Modern Times, which is co-edited with Ari Jaskowitz from UPenn Press in 2015, and Colonialism and the Jews, published in Indiana by Indiana University Press in 2017, co-edited with Lisa Moses-Leff and Maud Mandel. He holds a PhD and an MA in history from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a BA in history and French from Amherst College, and we're thrilled that he could be here today.
And it is my pleasure to introduce Avinoam Pat, who I also have known for many years and am thrilled to see here in this context. And I think perhaps will be an ongoing theme tonight as well. Avi and I are both Holocaust scholars, and as we heard, not all of us are trained necessarily in our PhD work in anti-Semitism, and yet here we all find ourselves kind of doing more and more on the topic, especially with the rising anti-Semitism we've seen in the world, but also on our campuses. So I think it's interesting and disappointing, but nice that we all can meet together and share ideas and learn from one another. Also, importantly, I'd be remiss if I didn't say that I appreciate Avi's support in baseball season when the Astros are playing, because we are Houstonians by background. So that's always fun. So let me say, Avi Pat is the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies and the Director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. He's the author of multiple books on Jewish responses to the Holocaust, including Finding Home and Homeland, Jewish Youth and Zionism in the Aftermath of the Holocaust from Wayne State in 2009. He co-edited with Michael Berkowitz, who I also did my master's degree under, so another connection there. In 2010, the book is entitled We Are Here, New Approaches to the Study of Jewish Displaced Persons in Post-War Germany. And then several projects at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., USHMM, another connection, including work on their Jewish responses to persecution, 1938 to 1940 in 2011. He recently completed a book on the early post-war memory of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising called The Jewish Heroes of Warsaw, The Afterlife of Revolt, Wayne State 2021. And then I was really pleased to see this as well, an interesting topic, Laughter After, Humor in the Holocaust. He published with David Slutsky and Gabby Finder in April of 2020. And then another connection, I was pleased to work with him and Laura Hilton, who are, the two of them are co-editors of a 2020 volume called Understanding and Teaching the Holocaust, which deals with all aspects of teaching Holocaust studies in various ways. And then finally, in spring of 2022, and one of the reasons we really thought about him to have this conversation tonight, he facilitated a one-credit course, a new one-credit, I like how the pop-up course, I love this like cultural and academic exchange here at the University of Connecticut called Why the Jews? Confronting Anti-Semitism, which in one semester reached over 1,600 students. And then finally this year, he is serving as visiting assistant professor of Holocaust studies at New York University. So we are thrilled to have you here. Thank you.
And I'll just quickly introduce Professor David Schraub, who's welcome back to something we're sponsoring at MSU. He's assistant professor of law at Lewis and Clark Law School, where he teaches courses on constitutional law and anti-discrimination law. He previously taught at DePaul University, University of California-Berkeley, and the University of Illinois. He has published extensively on the subjects of anti-Semitism and anti-discrimination more broadly in both academic and popular outlets, such as the California Law Review, the American Political Science Review, and the Association of Jewish Studies, as well as the Atlantic, the Jewish Daily Forward, and Haaretz. He holds a JD from the University of Chicago Law School and a PhD from the University of California-Berkeley. and as we mentioned, has organized the second annual conference on law versus anti-Semitism at Lewis and Clark Law School. And people are invited, I think, to attend and submit for that. And we found some of your articles, David, very engaging and timely. And that's why, one of the reasons we're having you back. So our first question that we'll put to all three of you, is what motivated you to increase an understanding of anti-Semitism on your campus?
Should I start?
Might take it each in kind of alphabetical order, perhaps, or if you're moved, you can do it that way as well.
If David has something he wants to start with, I'm happy to. Oh, all right.
If it's alphabetical, it's you, Ethan.
So thank you so much for the invitation. Thank you, Kirsten, for that really warm and kind introduction. It's good to see all of you and be back virtually at MSU. And I'm looking forward to some opportunity to actually be there in person, hopefully the next time we have occasion to gather. So for me, I wasn't trained as a specialist in anti-Semitism, even though anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred and exclusion have been very important to my work from early on. But for instance, when I wrote about Jews and Muslims in France and the Francophone world, a lot of people considered that book that I wrote my first book to in some ways be an anti-alarmist book, if you will. And so I sometimes tell people that as a prefatory remark to the fact that what really led me into this work on campus is that in my first year at Berkeley, in the spring of 2019, I became alarmed, as it were, by things that I saw around me. There was an incident in student government that spring where there were a number of unfortunate things said in a student government meeting. But the remark that really struck me and many other people was that after there had been complaints about Jews being excluded from the student government discussion and a number of groups being excluded on what was actually a technical problem with the slate that had won the student government election, but that was going to have consequences for people not being seated. The response from one student was, I was just hearing a whole bunch of white tears, a whole bunch of Zionist tears, and y'all don't even know anything about disenfranchisement, right? And so my reaction to that was, we're probably not going to come to agreement about the Middle East conflict. We don't have to, but we can probably do better than just saying things that are so ignorant of history and so ignorant of the challenges of Jewish history and contemporary reality. And so from that, what that led me towards saying, okay, what can we do educationally, right? What can we do on our campus to try to shift the conversation and shift the culture, really? And that's the work that we've been engaged in for the last 3.5 years with what we call the Antisemitism Education Initiative, a series of programs where we do trainings for various groups on campus, where we created a video that I think many of you are familiar with, that we've used in a lot of our trainings and that has now been used by a lot of educators across the country, where we bring a number of important expert speakers each year, and where we work closely with administrators, including in equity and inclusion, which has become a major ally in that work on campus. And basically, my motivation was that I think anti-Semitism education has to be in the lexicon of larger diversity, equity, and inclusion education, where it has not been historically at Berkeley or on most campuses. And that I think the Jewish students need to know that their concerns are being taken seriously, and that they deserve the same, not more, but the same level of kind of protection in terms of knowing that they're going to be welcome in all spaces on campus as other students. Right. And, not that their ideas aren't going to be challenged, not that some of their closely held beliefs aren't going to be challenged. That's part of education, but that they're not going to be excluded based on either affiliations or assumed affiliations. And so trying to create that atmosphere and change that culture on our campus and beyond has been what motivated me in doing this work.
All right, I'll pick up next. We're doing Katz, Pat, Schraub, that order. So, all right. Well, first of all, thank you for the warm welcome. And I wish we could be in person in Lansing. We'll have to do that another time, but it's nice to see everybody on Zoom. And thank you for organizing this program. And thank you, Amy, for the warm welcome. And I just have to say, we haven't talked since the World Series, so Ghost Rose. I'll say, like, to answer the specifics of sort of what prompted us to have a deeper engagement with confronting anti-Semitism on our campus. As you know, similarly as Ethan referenced, there were a number of specific incidents which prompted our need to engage with this more deeply. Although I'll say that the specific incidents which took place during the pandemic, when students were on campus, but a lot of the coursework was either taking place online, or students sort of felt isolated and alone, and there were a number of incidents that involved either anti-Semitic graffiti, swastika spray painted on a building opposite the Hillel building, various things that took place on campus, which paralleled kind of this alarming situation that we've seen across the country over the last several years. So what we were witnessing on our campus, which was extremely alarming, was something that we'll talk about, that we've seen across the state of Connecticut, across the United States, sort of in a much broader context. But after these incidents took place, a number of our students felt that their concerns were not sufficiently being addressed, that, as Ethan referenced, they were not being heard, right? That Jewish students, when they voiced concerns about anti-Semitism on campus, that their concerns weren't being heard, and that there was a need to address this more directly. And so they circulated a petition asking the administration to do something about it. Now, during the pandemic, and really in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd, at the same time, the university had developed a new model for what was called a one-credit pop-up class, which Amy referenced in her introduction. And the first iterations of that pop-up class, which were large-scale online classes that were free, and I think that's an important component of this, free large-scale online classes worth 1 credit. There were a number of classes that had taken place before our anti-Semitism class, including one on COVID, sort of explaining to thousands of people in our UConn community, what is the coronavirus? How are we going to confront it? There was another, after the killing of George Floyd, there was another course which was pioneered, I think, in the fall of 2020 on confronting anti-Black racism. And so our class, the Why the Jews Confronting Anti-Semitism, which I'll drop a link into the chat, and maybe you can share it with the broader audience. Our class was part of this new model, which enabled us to reach a huge range of students across the UConn community, and was really a fruitful collaboration between our excellent faculty. We have really excellent faculty across the gamut of Jewish history, from antiquity to the present, and wonderful partners from Hillel and other organizations, the Anti-Defamation League, who assisted us in creating some of the resources for the class. But we felt very strongly that in developing a course that we were going to educate about anti-Semitism, that as an institution of higher education, we should be the ones who were teaching about the topic, that we should employ faculty experts who have real expertise in teaching about anti-Judaism and teaching about anti-Semitism, but also about teaching about Jewish history and Jewish culture, that we should really be the ones who are doing this type of education, especially if we're doing it on a college campus. And we may address this later, but we felt pretty strongly that we didn't want to have outside groups coming onto the campus doing this kind of education. We had faculty experts who could do this. And I have to say, we also recognize that this was an excellent opportunity to introduce our faculty to a much larger, engaged and interested student population. And so we ended up having, the first time the class was offered in the spring of 2022, we had 1,600 students enroll in this class. We're going to offer it again in the spring of 2023. I think we'll have a similar number of students. But we also realized that for many of them, this would be the first time that they ever, and maybe the only time, that they would take a class in where they would learn about Judaic studies or Jewish history and Jewish culture. And so we were very also, we could talk about this more, we were very careful to not just teach the history of the Jews and Jewish culture through the lens of anti-Semitism, and to work together with our faculty experts and community partners in the Hillel to teach more broadly about who are the Jews, what are Jews, what is Jewish culture, so that people wouldn't just learn about it through the lens of anti-Semitism. I'll stop myself there.
So yeah, first of all, I'm really thrilled to be back, and I want to thank y'all for inviting me again, and at least tacitly affirming that I didn't bomb the first time out that I joined an MSU event. So I'm thrilled to be here, thrilled to be part of this really important discussion. So I've been at Lewis and Clark only 2 years, and before that I was at UC Berkeley. I was at Berkeley for the event that Ethan alluded to, and several other ones beside. And this is so anti-Semitism has been a pretty central part of my research and academic profile kind of from day one. So I was always thinking about it. But once I arrived at Lewis and Clark, and it's a relatively small school, it's got a relatively small Jewish population, it's just a relatively quiet place. So there haven't been that many, incidents, so to speak, that I've had to address yet, kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. But there's only been a really small handful for which I'm very fortunate about, feel very fortunate about. But one thing that I feel very strongly about is that the study of anti-Semitism, the inclusion of Jews just generally, is something that we need to normalize. And by that, I mean, it can't just happen at the moment of crisis. So even though there wasn't some precipitating event at Lewis and Clark, like, oh, this terrible thing happened, and now we need to have a panel or have an event or have a conference. One of the reasons why I wanted to bring this conference out to Lewis and Clark, and I'm really excited that we did, is kind of because nothing really is happening. And it's important to, just normalize that there is this community, this Jewish community that exists in Portland and at Lewis and Clark, that these issues are important, that they're part of the broader ferment of social issues and social controversy, that we should thinking about, not exclusively by any stretch of the imagination, but that we should be thinking about, as part of the normal cocktail of academic debates and social policy making and public and private discussion that one would hope would occur at a university. And so to that end, I think to some extent, as much as it's very important to have these big events like this event or like the conference that we're hosting at the college, the moments of kind of casual inclusion, I think, can be equally important. And just that letting people know that Jews are members of the community and are Jewish kind of 24 hours a day. They're not Jewish, the 1 hour or the one day where there was an anti-Semitic incident, and then we were Jewish, very visibly Jewish then, and stopped being Jewish for the rest of the time period. And that sort of like casual notation that there's this Jewish presence, so that students who aren't Jewish, if they have a question, they know who to ask. Students who are Jewish, if they have a concern, or they just are looking for something that's not a concern, they want something very positive, a place to have a Shabbos dinner. That those are present. And so thinking about anti-Semitism kind of beyond the boiling point, beyond the crisis point, but as, part, unfortunately part of, but only one part of a broader continual Jewish presence even at a relatively smaller school like Lewis and Clark has been foundational to my approach, particularly moving from a place like Berkeley where there's, it's much larger and there are a lot more crises, to some place considerably smaller and in many ways lower profile.
Great, thank you so much for those. And again, I really look forward to our discussion and Q&A later because there's so many overlaps here. So I'm going to pose a second question, and this is a big one. So what have been the main challenges and successes in increasing this awareness of anti-Semitism and framing it particularly through an educational approach on your campus, as you all alluded to already, as a academic space, how to approach anti-Semitism in that space, and again, challenges and also successes that you've had doing that.
This is one of the really important questions. I think for us, the basic challenge, which I think is true on a lot of our campuses, was to kind of break through and persuade a large enough cluster of leaders on campus that anti-Semitism education needs to be part of the larger fabric of equity and inclusion. And I do feel very good about what we've achieved at Berkeley in that regard. When we started this work, we had to kind of drag the people in equity and inclusion kicking and screaming to take seriously the fact that Jewish students and anti-Semitism really needed to be part of their purview. There's been a significant change in both the leadership and the culture of that division at Berkeley in the time that we've done this work. And now they are really full partners with us. They are very strongly affirming of how much they view Jews and anti-Semitism as totally part of the work that they do, and that they've reached out to the Jewish community on campus in a number of important instances in the past year to let them know how much they want to support Jewish students, and they've worked on building relationships there, not only in times of crisis. So but that was a big challenge, and it remains an ongoing challenge, I think, in terms of the larger culture. I think a lot of our success is in changing the culture for administration and staff here. A challenge always is that changing that culture for students is both more difficult and more transient, right? A quarter of the campus is going to leave at the end of the year every single year and going to change completely. And so it's a population that's always a moving target. There are sometimes pockets of students that are driving you crazy on these issues who you also know are going to leave. So it's not all bad, but it's the reality that you're navigating. I think one of the big successes that we've achieved is just, we took an infrastructure of relationships, which really began before I came to Berkeley, created this Chancellor's Committee on Jewish Life and Campus Climate that I now chair. And that really enabled us to start to build an infrastructure of awareness in education. And I always say you need that first infrastructure of relationships before you can have an infrastructure of training and education. And we've been able to really, pivot one to the other and do a lot of trainings across campus. Our resources are part of the resources that they give out during what they call Golden Bear orientation. And we're a resource now that people turn to. And as Equity and Inclusion thinks about developing a more systematic and holistic set of trainings, they're including anti-Semitism, and they assume they're going to partner with us in that work. But I think one of the biggest challenges for us from the beginning, and illustrated really vividly this fall, as many of you are aware, is that there are outside actors within the Jewish community across the country who have very strong ideas about what should be going on campuses, and who are, there are some of those organizations that we've partnered with closely and that we've worked with successfully, and that really respect scholarship and respect expertise and respect the educational environment of a campus. And there are others that really have their own agendas and frankly are not driven primarily by concern for the reality on the ground or the welfare of students on a specific campus in the way they pursue that agenda. And so as much as we've had success, as much as the work we've done on our campus, we've been consulted by many other campuses now across the country. The film that we created, as I said, is being used by a lot of other campuses. And so we have a brand, which I'm proud of. And at the same time, we saw the limitations of all that with what happened this fall with what began with a story in the Jewish Journal of LA describing what they called as Berkeley developing Jewish-free zones to depict an unfortunate and challenging situation at Berkeley Law School, but which did not resemble that headline or the description that went viral very quickly. And what you see in that is just that, especially certain campuses that have a target on their back, there is always the possibility that the work you're doing on the ground can be disrupted by people who have different agendas. And that remains a challenge. And it means that sometimes you're simultaneously responding to real problems on your campus for Jewish and other students, and you're having to fight a kind of PR battle out in the world to tell a story of what's really going on in your campus.
Thanks for bringing that up, Ethan. And I think I'll pick up there. I mean, I know we're talking about challenges and successes, but I think that is one of those key challenges, which is dealing with perception of what's happening on college campuses and what's actually happening, or what we experience. And I think there's a real gap, right? Because there are certain sort of political forces that want to emphasize the notion that college is a very scary place for Jewish students. And I think by and large, right, 99% of our students have had wonderful experiences, as they should, going through college. And I don't want to sort of give in to the notion that it's terrifying and that every college is, but you do have these articles that come out and they're good for clicks, and it does create a perception. And so I think kind of the work that we're talking about doing, which can be an important part of both educating, but I also believe very strongly that, Judaic studies and centers for Judaic studies as an academic field, we are very well positioned, I think, to play a key role in both pushing back against this narrative and at the same time, using our expertise to engage directly when issues do come up or when there are incidents, and that we can have conversations with our students on campus or with fellow faculty members on campus to engage directly with these issues. And I think we should be doing this more, as an organization. And here I'm talking about, the Association for Jewish Studies and other groups, that I think we can play an even more prominent role in sort of engaging, responding to some of these things. I've mentioned some of the challenges and successes already. I mean, I'll just say briefly that the challenge of kind of doing a 7-week class on why the Jews confronting anti-Semitism, logistically, organizationally, historically, was a huge and daunting challenge to both. We all know academics. It's not easy to get 12 to 15 academics to sort of basically volunteer their expertise, and it's time consuming, and it was a lot of work. But I'm really proud of what we were able to create, and I think I have wonderful colleagues at the University of Connecticut who were very generously gave of their time of expertise, as well as, and I've mentioned our colleagues from the Hillel, and we had a former student from the Anti-Defamation League who works for their Center for Extremism, who it was really important for the students to also see, like a UConn alum who works for the ADL and is very active in confronting online hate, sharing her expertise as well. I will say that, as a success, obviously enrolling 1,600 students, we were thrilled with that. I'll say that, the university, the administration, it's a major contribution from the administration to basically give away 1 credit for free. And it's not just for our class, it's for the confronting anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, the other classes that are online classes. It's a major contribution to say, we believe this is important. We want our students to learn this. We're going to invest and basically give away free credits. Like, that's a real monetary contribution to doing this. We can talk about this a little bit more. I think one of the things that I mentioned before is that, I did have this concern about framing all of Jewish history and Jewish culture through the lens of anti-Semitism. I didn't want to sort of give into that lachrymose view of Jewish history as sort of a series of suffering and persecution. And I also, Amy alluded to the fact that I'm very much a Holocaust scholar in the field of Holocaust studies, but I also was very careful to, when we were talking about anti-Semitism, specifically talking about the American context, to focus a great deal on the history of anti-Semitism in America, so that it would not be perceived as something that happened over there, happened in Europe, emanated from Germany, was the epicenter being in the destruction of European Jewry, but to focus on a rich history of homegrown anti-Semitism here in America that very frequently students never learn anything about. And I think, very often the challenge is that you could teach about anti-Semitism, but it's done with Holocaust education. And I am the foremost advocate for teaching about the Holocaust, but I think we also have to make sure to teach about the history of what happened in this country, not just in other countries. We can talk some more about definitions, what's definition to use, which was a challenge, and how to frame that. We had a whole unit of the class talking about, when does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitism? That was an interesting challenge for how we're going to organize that and do that as well. And I'll just mention, Ethan, the first unit of the class, when we were defining anti-Semitism, we used your film, which I think was just excellent, and was also like, we need resources like that speak to our students and speak sort of in the language that our students understand, is not just academics sort of talking to them, but sort of speaks in a video language that they understand. I'll stop myself there.
Yeah, I want to very much echo what I think both Ethan and Avinoam said about the sort of balance that needs to be struck between, on the one hand, recognizing there are some people who want to completely whitewash that there is such thing as anti-Semitism on campus, and they it's all a myth, it's all rabble rousing, it's all crying wolf, and that's just not true. It's just not true. And we really need to push back strongly against the notion that there isn't a there, because there very much is. But at the same time, there is also the line of argument that basically treats many campuses, college campuses as a whole, as this sort of war zone where Jews spend their entire 4 years just in terror for their lives and can't do anything at all, and that's just wildly ridiculous. And I would go through both sides of that especially when I was back at Berkeley. And I very distinctly remember, actually, I had somebody who was in, an online Twitter persona who trolled me for about a year. But it started as this person being expressing sympathy about how horrible it must be for me as a Jew who writes about, anti-discrimination and anti-Semitism, to be a Jew, who writes on those topics, to be in a place like Berkeley. And I kind of said, well, actually, my experience hasn't been bad. I've been felt very supported by my colleagues and by my dissertation advisor and all those people. And boy, was that ever the wrong answer. Because as soon as this person found out that I wasn't miserable, the only explanation that he could give was that I was a traitor, right? The only way you could be happy as a Jew at Berkeley in this person's mind was to be a self-hating Jew. And so that set off a lovely year of being constantly harassed by this person. It was actually probably the worst anti-Semitic harassment, ironically enough, I experienced while at Berkeley. And so, Ethan was diplomatic. I think that we have to say there are plenty of these outside groups and figures that are very helpful and very good and do a lot of good work. There are some that are bomb throwers, and very consciously so. And they're making, under the guise of allyship, they are promoting hatred of Jews on campus in a very serious and dangerous way. And I think that unfortunately, it is very worrisome, the degree to which they are part of the ecosystem. And I don't have clear ideas how to push back, because what they're trying to do is monopolize what it means to oppose anti-Semitism. And they're doing it in a way where opposing anti-Semitism is deeply alienating to, large campus constituencies, but frankly, deeply alienated to the Jews they purport to protect, for which they consider that to be a benefit because they live off miserable Jews, right? That is where they make their bones. And so this is not a bug, it is a feature of their model, and needs to be viewed as the danger that it is. Now, again, I'm now at a much quieter place that is somewhat off the radar, and I haven't gone through that at Lewis and Clark to the same degree. And what's happened at Lewis and Clark that I've been very pleased with, and I mentioned how, one of my ambitions was to model this sort of casual, open Jewishness, just so that people knew that this was part of the community, that the Jews were a presence to think about. And there have been I've been really pleased how that's borne fruit in a lot of different ways. And so one example, we don't have kind of the very deep, kind of DEI bureaucracy that a larger university has. A lot of what we do is faculty run. But a couple, at the end of last year, one of my colleagues who was on our DEI committee reached out to me, unprompted, and said, we're reforming some of our policies and programming and practices. And I just wanted to make sure that, we brought in Jewish perspectives and perspectives in anti-Semitism, because I know it's a concern, and sometimes it isn't brought up. And so I wanted to just talk with you about making sure how that's brought in. And part of me was very touched that, that again, it was not something that I had to drag somebody into doing. They reached out to me. They took the affirmative step, and that meant a lot to me. But I think it was in some ways what we would hope would happen. And it's reflective of this sort of genuine inclusion, which isn't just sort of the begrudging, forced, inclusion of Jews into this sort of programming, but just the general accepted normal consensus that it should be part of the programming. And likewise, just today, actually, the Lewis and Clark Law School students reformed. It had kind of gone dormant, and they relaunched the Jewish Law Students Association. And their first meeting was today, and I was the faculty advisor. And again, students had reached out to me and said, you know, is there the space for Jewish students? And I said, there was, but it kind of went moribund. And then they took it upon themselves that it's really important for us to have a voice and to be a presence. And so, you know, mostly they said because they just want to have that community, right? It's not, you know, for scary reasons. It's, you know, it would be fun to do some Shabbat dinners. It would be fun to just have people who, you know, have some things in common. But they also said, you know, and if something comes up, people know we're here, right? That we're not some mystery, that we're not, you know, that it's not, again, something that nobody has had a thought about until you know, until the moment of crisis. And so I'm feeling really good about how that played out. And again, it's not something that is primarily being motivated by the what Ethan called the alarmist conception, right? Or just responding at the moment of crisis. It is about, you know, being, again, Jewish, just that we are Jews 24/7, right? That's just part of who we are. It is a normal part of who we are. It's how we come to the table, and presenting ourselves in that way, in just a very kind of casual sort of way, I think has a lot of power, actually, and is creating what so far for me has been an extremely healthy environment at Lewis and Clark, where when I did want to do this more big ticket item event, right? I got, you know, nothing but support. And in fact, the Lewis and Clark Law Review decided to host a symposium based on our conference. You know, there's a line of discourse that would say, oh, that's going to be controversial, or you know, you're dealing with these students. Are they really going to want to talk about anti-Semitism? And there was really nothing of it, right? It was they were happy to do it. They've been happy to work with me. And they're excited about this event and think it's important. It's all the things that you could ask for. And I'm really, really pleased to see that.
Okay, well, that's great. I mean, this was really so incredibly rich and interesting to hear everyone talk about challenges and have a lot of echoes of the challenges that people have experienced, particularly in thinking about like outside groups, and then a lot of echoes also of similarities in successes and thinking about like DEI and inclusion in particular. So it's really heartwarming. So the third question that we wanted to ask is sort of pushes on this a little bit to ask about increasing how you all have increased awareness, to what extent you've tried to increase awareness of anti-Semitism through an expansion or adaptation of existing programs, orientations, or workshops that promote DEI on campus. So this is a little bit more about sort of how you've made this happen and sort of in the weeds. I'm thinking in particular, maybe about classes, but also about some of the other kinds of DEI kinds of things that exist on campus, and how you've expanded, adapted them. And this is something that we're really grappling with right now and working with. So we're really interested to hear that answer.
Yeah. I mean, we started by saying we have to create an architecture where anti-Semitism education, I mean, in similar terms to what both Avi and David talked about, right? That we didn't want it to be reactive. We wanted it to be part of the general architecture of DEI, or now what they're calling DEIBJ at Berkeley. I'm sure that the acronym is going to get longer. But you know, what we found initially with the challenge of not having a particularly engaged DEI office around these issues was that student affairs was a better address for us. And I know a number of colleagues on other campuses who've had that experience as well. I think it is slowly changing. I think DEI officers already are much more grappling with the issue of Jewish students and anti-Semitism than they were when we started this work 3.5 years ago. But part of it is figuring out, like, where are the avenues on your campus where people are ready to work with you? It had partly to do with relationships that have been built before. And sometimes student affairs is more nimble. Those offices usually have been around for longer. One of the big challenges with DEI is that religion has typically not been something that they have viewed as part of their ambit. So both Jewish students and Muslim students, for instance, Sikh students also in some places, are really underserved or not served by those offices. And I think it's often helpful to talk about it in the general terms of the categories rather than like, I'm coming here and I care about Jewish students and that's what you should care about too. Although we all know that framing anti-Semitism as a problem of religious discrimination, full stop, is a problematic way of framing anti-Semitism, but we're looking for basically inroads to get into the conversation, into the architecture of inclusion. So, what we found over time was that they were moving away in orientation from a group-based model of inclusion because they didn't really have time to do like 8 different trainings in orientation for all the different groups that justifiably have, historical exclusions and would want people to understand the specifics of their experience. They moved toward a much more generalized model and then making resources available. So we've been able to plug into that. But on our campus, and I think probably on a lot of campuses, these issues are in flux. Right now, the last meeting we had with DEI, they said, a lot of people don't like to hear about trainings. We're moving away from the language of trainings. They want it to be more experiential, which sounds great. Hard to figure out exactly how you program for that. I want to kind of go back to just expand on something that was said a minute ago, and then I'm going to talk about a little bit of a different answer to this question quickly, I promise. I just want to say, I talked about the challenge of outside groups. That in some ways is a manifestation of a conceptual challenge, and it's also a catalyst of that conceptual challenge that Avi alluded to, but that we probably should talk more about at some point here, which is the line between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and the difficulty of having that conversation. And I think we, at least on our campus, and I think on a lot of campuses, we lack spaces, physical or organizational, for thoughtful conversations around the relationship between Zionism, Israel, anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. It's a very complicated topic. And we also lack space for people to engage in that conversation in honest ways where they can really grapple publicly and they can make mistakes and they can change their mind about issues, because those are really hard conversations. And we're in a moment that's so polarized and partly very impacted by outside organizations where people are afraid to speak about those topics, and that's doing a great disservice to Jewish students and to other students. So I just want to name that challenge. I just want to mention, in terms of adaptation to other DEI systems, putting on a different hat of having co-chaired this task force for the past 20 months with Lila Corwin-Berman for the AJS, this task force on anti-Semitism and academic freedom. And I'm very proud of the work that we've done. Our most tangible product has been a set of guidelines. It's not very long, guidelines on anti-Semitism and academic freedom. And that product is really shaped in a lot of ways by trying to think about anti-Semitism in parallel with these other issues. I'm putting it in the chat. And to be kind of really intellectually honest about what we want to expect from campuses vis-a-vis Jewish students and anti-Semitism, and how that compares to what we normally expect and demand vis-a-vis other historically marginalized groups. So for me, that's also been part of trying to think within current structures about how we do this work, across the country on different campuses.
Thanks, Ethan. I'll just, in terms of sort of thinking about how we've tried to expand or adapt existing programs and working with DEI. I think one of the interesting challenges is, I was talking about kind of developing a course that's a 1-credit class that's free, that's open to a broad segment of the entire student population. And one of the things that's rewarding about the class is the number of students who signed up for the class really wanting to be allies and sort of saying, I want to learn about this. I think this is a problem. I feel like the role that I can play is knowing how to identify and speak up for it. And that's exactly what you want, right? In terms of a campus climate and a campus community. And I think one of the things that's been a challenge, or that I've observed, is that sometimes what often happens in a campus community, and I see in the audience, for example, our Hillel director, Dina Ostreicher, is in the audience of this program, as are some of our professors at the University of Connecticut. and I'm sure this is common in a lot of places, right? There's very often a divide between sort of what happens on the academic side of campus and what happens on the residential side of campus. You know, the student life experience versus the academic experience, where you know, both people who are out off campus don't necessarily have a perception of what that difference is, and students very often like don't perceive it in the same way that, you know, the faculty might perceive it, right? And I think that is one of the real challenges, right? Like there's a role that we can play in terms of improving campus climate, but very often I find that there's a communication gap between what like administrators who might be involved in trying to do things for diversity, equity, and inclusion are doing, and not knowing what's happening on the academic side. And I don't think that this is unique to our campus. I think this is something that is probably common in most campuses, that one of the most important things we can do is to break down that divide and increase you know, communication, increase collaboration, bring our faculty experts into conversation with people who are in student life, res life, DEI, right? Because there's still a divide, right? There's still a disconnect. There's still, and that's very often even the place that I think sometimes they'll go to outside organizations for help because they don't know that there's somebody on campus who, you know, is there and on faculty and can help facilitate this conversation. And I'll just say the last thing is that I think what we really should be doing, to your, you know, your point about sort of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism and creating a climate, I want us to have a climate on campus where people can engage in conversation, where people might disagree about something, right? The university is a place where people very often disagree about things, but bring facts to the conversation, engage in a dialogue with other people. We as faculty should be modeling that sort of engaged, civilized dialogue and conversation. And, you know, if you learn something through the process and maybe somebody teaches you something that you didn't know beforehand, right? That would be a very productive outcome. But very often we're shutting off that possibility of people engaging with one another, learning from one another, and sort of just retreating into our silos, which is, I think, one of the big problems that we have in our society as a whole. So, you know, if that's one thing that we can do, then that would be a productive outcome.
One thing I want to make a plea for is I think that having, you know, classes that are specifically devoted to anti-Semitism, to Jewish studies is incredibly important. I think those classes are incredibly valuable. Articles on that incredibly valuable. These are really good things. But I think it also needs to be complemented by kind of weaving in anti-Semitism, Judaism to what we might consider the, you know, the survey course, for lack of a better way of putting it, the general topics. I teach a class on anti-discrimination, right? Generally, right? It's not anti-Semitic discrimination, it's just anti-discrimination. But I just make sure that some of my readings, right, or some of the examples, right, that are used are going to be issues of anti-Semitism. Again, that it's just part of what you learn and what you talk about when you talk about the problem of discrimination more broadly. You're writing a paper. I'm writing a paper on microaggressions right now. It's not about anti-Semitic microaggressions, but some of the examples, some of the discourse is going to be about microaggressions. And again, you know, there's a little part of me that you know reads a little too much Tablet magazine and assumes like, oh, they're going to project all of anybody who cares about microaggressions will never let you talk about anti-Semitism. Turns out they will, right? Actually, they will, and I've had very, very positive experiences overall doing that sort of work as a scholar in terms of how I teach it, as a way of relating to students who might be very different from myself. I had a student come in recently, and they were talking about, you know, some issues of discrimination they were facing as a woman of color that I didn't relate to directly, but I could say, you know, I had this experience, you know, recently as a Jew in this community, and they're like, oh yeah, I think you were talking about the same thing, and we were able together to kind of talk through the issue in a way but that I think enriched both of our understandings, and again made this not competition but rather collaboration, that these are problems that we share in common. They're not points of differentiation. And on that note, I think one of the more destructive lines of argument that I've seen on this front, and I think is fortunately, I think, a minority point of view within the Jewish community, but it's certainly a vocal minority, are the people who think we can sort of dynamite like DEI type initiatives or blow up our system of anti-discrimination law without it simultaneously redounding to destroy the fight against anti-Semitism. There is no way to tackle anti-Semitism but through the sorts of policies and practices that enable us to fight other forms of discrimination as well. And if you kneecap it for others, you're kneecapping it for Jews too. If you're a litigator, right now we're in the thick of a big legal debate over the scope of anti-discrimination law, and how expansive should our protections be, for gay and lesbian patrons of a business, right, or sex discrimination or racial discrimination. And there are a lot of ways to answer that question. In law school, we can debate the advantages and disadvantages of taking a broader or narrower view. But the precedents in these cases, the arguments in these cases never can be cabined to those particular forms of oppression. If you're limiting remedies for anti-gay discrimination, you are inevitably limiting remedies for anti-Semitic discrimination as well, anti-Jewish discrimination as well. There's no one without the other. And so the move to take out one ends out taking out the other. Right, when people protest against these sort of what they deem to be overly expansive iterations of anti-racism practice, DEI pedagogy, or practices or bureaucracy, some of those critiques are perfectly well taken, but the more fundamentalist versions of them, right, if we take them seriously as principles, also mean severely hamstringing what can and can't be called anti-Semitism. Right, there's again no one without the other. And so I think, again, there's a lot of room to debate, how broadcast versus how narrowcast should we be on all of these issues. But there's no way to kind of seal off the discussion about anti-Semitism, the fight against anti-Semitism, from these sorts of broader trends, as much as some people would like to. And some people certainly want to, they care quite a bit about racism, but maybe don't care so much about anti-Semitism. Or vice versa. But the fact is that despite anybody's best efforts, this is really something that we're ultimately going to be all in together. And the moves that we're seeing in broader society and law, certainly what I focus on, that are really pushing towards kind of more narrow articulations of what discrimination is, and oftentimes more sensorial responses to articulations about racism, like we've seen in Florida, for example, recently, inevitably end up doing the same thing to fight against anti-Semitism. And it's no accident that the sorts of laws which are being used to kind of ban critical race theory also are taking Holocaust books out of the classroom, right? That's not a mistake. That's not something that could be corrected by better lawmaking. Right, it has to be that way, right? And so if you're doing the one, you're doing the other, right? And in that sense, I think the pivot that I think this question gets at quite aptly has to be about how to think in terms of the commonality, thinks in terms of alignment, rather than, I think an ultimately futile and short-sighted attempt at separation and differentiation. I don't think that's going to work, and I don't think it can work.
Yeah, thank you for all of your insights and comments, which, like Kirsten said, we've shared a lot of these things. So we've also banded sometimes with seven different programs on campus, which are focused on ethnicity and race and gender, and common efforts to combat hate and white nationalism. And we've had several iterations of that. So I think that that's important. And we've also stressed relationships, as we've heard, with different housing, residential advising, DI officers, and we were fortunate at MSU. We've faced some challenges because, as was said in Berkeley and other universities, in the beginning there was no other than particular classes that Kirsten and Amy teach. There was nothing incorporated about anti-Semitism in the system in terms of orientations for new students and faculty or in the DI networks. But once we started introducing that, inquiring about our efforts to include that, we've had a lot of successes, and we're asked to be part of the DEI strategic committee for the university that worked for a year and a half, and are making a lot of progress, including not just talking about anti-Semitism, but issues of inclusion for Jews on campus. So we worked really hard with others on a much more robust religious observance policy for MSU that has just been instituted and is coming out in different phases. So it's not necessarily just anti-Semitism, but also inclusion generally. And by the way, we've used Ethan's video, we've used the AJS guideline that you talked about, we've used reference some of your articles and as well, David, in our guide. So we have one last question from us, and maybe if we can just to give time to field some questions from the audience as well, maybe you can keep kind of the answers to that pretty brief, and then we'll have more time for the attendees to ask questions. So the last question from us is, what are your current and future plans for increasing this awareness, not only on your campus, but in a broader fashion? So if you can maybe take a minute to answer that, and then we'll open it up to the questions that are in Q&A and those that are waiting. Yeah.
Sure. I'll try to be efficient here. Basically, I'll focus on a couple of things. One is just we're trying to ramp up the quantity of our programs and have more dialogical programming. It is partly in direct response to the events that took place at the law school in the fall, but it's also part of a broader attempt to kind of change the atmosphere, specifically, especially around questions of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. I did a workshop early in the semester at the law school on anti-Semitism. We are doing an event in 2 weeks that I'm doing with a very strongly pro-Palestinian professor around what we're calling contested meanings of Zionism. And we have a series of other programs in the course of the spring. And we're really looking for opportunities to engage students in conversation, to use these programs to open a conversation where there is none on our campus. I just have to stress there is really no dialogue around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which I think is incredibly problematic. And the thing is, we need dialogue not in reactive moments of crisis. We need dialogue that lays a foundation for a conversation and relationships, so that when the crisis comes, people look at each other differently than just through the lens of the politics. And that takes a lot of building. So that's one of the things we want to emphasize. We're very fortunate and very happy that we have just hired a full-time program director, Dr. Greg Drinkwater, who I think some of you know as a colleague in American Jewish history, and who has a lot of organizational experience working in equity and inclusion type of issues, particularly in the LGBTQ community. And so that's going to allow us to, I think, really expand our footprint, not only at Berkeley, but also with a project that's supporting underserved campuses across California that don't have, Hillel generally don't have anti-Semitism education. We're going to be working to provide them with toolkits for their campuses, because of course, even if they don't have many Jewish students, they have many other students who still need to be educated, and anti-Semitism is part of their equity and inclusion. So I'm glad we're expanding, and you know, there's a lot more work to do.
Thanks, Ethan. I'll just add that you know, we're obviously continuing to offer this class. We're going to offer it again in the spring, in March to April. We're also looking into ways to turn the class into something that we can. Right now, it's only available to students who are enrolled at the University of Connecticut. Something that we can offer to a broader off-campus community as well, which will require a different way to sort of deliver that. I do want to circle back to something that David mentioned that I think is incredibly important as well, and I'm so happy that you brought it up, which is essentially this notion of the intersectionality of all of this. And I think, you know, this might be something that we can talk about more in the Q&A, but that, you know, one of the things that we talk about in the class is the importance of essentially building alliances and finding like-minded people who, you know, are interested in learning about this, want to speak up and support and call it out, and that these are not things that happen sort of, you know, in isolation, that one can experience anti-Semitism and racism and homophobia and xenophobia all at the same time, and that these are all deeply, you know, interconnected. And I think one of the things that I hope to be able to continue in terms of developing this is that in order to have this type of education that is interconnected, that shows the connections between all of these different isms, right? This is part of safeguarding and protecting our democracy, which I think is one of the key things that we have to communicate, that it's so vitally, critically important. But we are in this moment where sometimes it is sort of the what about me, right? What about my cause? What about my persecution, as opposed to seeing it as something that is more broadly interconnected. And I think hopefully, in terms of moving forward, we'll be able to explore those connections so that it's not just a one-off, that sort of everybody gets their own class, but that is something that we can have in conversation. And I'll stop myself there because I know there's much more for us to discuss in the Q&A.
Yeah, I think that all of those things are wonderful things. We're very fortunate in the roles that we have, that we get to, teach and write. And so we are always in a position to just kind of keep talking about these sorts of things and keep putting them on the public agenda in a regular fashion, which I genuinely think is more than half the battle, right? I think so much of this is just kind of getting things on the table, making sure that they're part of the discourse, making sure that they're part of the conversation. And I've really found, again, between so much of what gets clicks, and maybe this is just inevitable, maybe this is a feature of what it means to be media, but so much of it is either, what Ethan called alarmist, or it's denialist, right? It's that this is all made up, right? But I have found that there is a genuine thirst for something different from that. Something that isn't, treating every single kind of awry student government resolution as, the new rise of the Nazis, and something that isn't that, every Jewish student who, dares complain about anti-Semitism is a stooge and a patsy of the big bad Zionist conspiracy, right? There is a lot of people out there who I think really are interested, and I think this conversation I think hopefully is one model of something like that, that wants something that isn't just about the cheap shots and the talking points, whichever those are, but is trying to dig into these issues in a sophisticated and interconnected way. And I think there is an audience for that, and I think that there is a desire for that, and I think that sort of discussion can make a lot of progress, again, in making this so that this isn't just some sort of ideological trench warfare initiative, but rather is something that we work on because it's other people in our circle and in our community and in our friend group and in our family and in our department who we care about and who care about us. And you do it that way, and not just in the point scoring sort of way. And in my experience, people will walk with you pretty far, right? Even down some very precarious terrain, as a lot of these issues are.
Thank you so much. And I also, we also agree that, sometimes the when does anti-Zionism cross into anti-Semitism is one of the most challenging aspects of what all of us engage in, and therefore having real dialogue is really important. So we try to work on that too. And so this fall we had a successful symposium with 6 different Palestinian and Israeli past peace negotiators had worked together on ideas for confederation as kind of a point of dialogue. And we had a lot of people from across campus coming. It was co-sponsored by Muslim Studies. And it was just one example of what we can do to foster that kind of real dialogue and conversation, in addition to other things that we're doing on anti-Semitism. So I'm going to gather some questions that are in the audience. One is maybe just a point of elaboration. I'll have these two together. One is we talk and educate about anti-Semitism, which is really important, but what's more important is what we as Jews can do about it, how can we attack it, and how can we make a difference for change and prevention. So I think some of you were talking about things you're doing in terms of change and prevention, but maybe it's a point for elaboration on that. And another question is, to what extent have you been able to get other minority groups involved in your course? Is the course required? Is it elective? How is it marketed to other minority groups? This would be, of course, a question for Avi, and to learn more about that course that you're teaching. So maybe we'll start with those.
I'll start and just answer that last question and the first one also, which I really appreciate. So I'll just mention it's interesting, in terms of the type of class and how we market it. So some students really like this style of learning, which is essentially it was a completely online asynchronous class that is basically we create all the content, record videos, provide links, provide readings, including a chapter from Dara Horn's People Love Dead Jews, which is based completely on Kirsten's wonderful book. We assigned that chapter about name changing. I just wanted to mention that, Kirsten. So what's interesting is some students just love taking a class like that they can do on their own time and sort of a self-guided tour. And so I know for a fact that we have had multiple students who have taken confronting anti-Black racism, confronting anti-Asian racism, confronting anti-Semitism, because they're fascinated by it and they love that style of class and it works for their schedule because they could take it whatever and do it as a self-guided way, and they get 3 credits for taking those 3 classes for free. So, I hope, and I think, we don't ask who the students are and what their background, but you can sort of get a sense on the basis of student names, and we do a part where they identify themselves. It's a hugely diverse community of students. We don't have that large of a Jewish student population at the University of Connecticut, I think maybe 10%. So most of the students are not Jewish, and we have a very diverse range of students who are taking the class, and it's not required. So it is completely elective, but you'd be surprised by how many students get to the end of their academic career and they have 119 credits and they need 1 more class to graduate. And so it does fill a need there. And I'll just say that in terms of the confronting part to the first question, not just educating, but confronting, I think that is an important connection there, where we are trying to train students to not just be able to learn what it is and identify it, but to speak out when they see it, to call it out, if it's in an online space or in a conversation or anywhere, to learn and be equipped to have the tools to say, that's not okay, or that is racist, or that is anti-Semitic, or that is Islamophobic, or whatever it is that we want them to call it, to have the tools and say, I learned about that, and I know that you shouldn't be able to say that. And I'll just say, sometimes when we think about the specter of anti-Semitism and the problem of anti-Semitism, one of the things that's important is in teaching about the long history, one of the things we learn about is that there are waves, right? Sometimes it rises and sometimes it declines, and we try to understand what is happening more broadly societally to help us understand, are we living through a dramatic change time? Are we living through major political and economic shift? Yes, that's one of the things that's happening now. We can see that historically. We can try to understand what's under the surface that is leading to the spread of, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. What role does the internet play in things that might have been traded in terms of like Holocaust denial, in newspapers that might have been given out in the past, now can spread with lightning speed in our age of misinformation and disinformation. So, but there are tools to confront that too, and there are ways to confront online anti-Semitism, and teaching about that also educates students that you don't just throw up your hands and there's nothing I can do. Yes, there are things that you can do to confront forms of online hate when you do see it.
Would anyone else like to address or elaborate on the questions? And I see Ethan motioning. I don't know. Otherwise, I'll ask another one of the questions. Yeah.
I mean, I'll just respond to the first question quickly. I mean, I understand the concern about like, what are we doing? How are we taking action? But I think it's a false dichotomy to separate out into education and action. The reality is that what we know best how to do at universities is education, and it's not flashy, right? It's not, I mean, we face this in very kind of stark and dramatic fashion with the response to these bylaws at the law school, and a huge range of actors saying, why doesn't the university, quote, do something, right? And what they often mean is, why don't you shut down these clubs that pass these bylaws? I'm not a lawyer, but I've listened to a lot of legal arguments, and the legal consensus appears to be pretty strong that that's not an option. And people have made strong arguments for why shutting down the clubs would be counterproductive. So what we turn to is really ramping up educational programming, ramping up opportunities for people to learn, yes, including about how to confront anti-Semitism. But the first and the most fundamental things they have to learn, because we learn a lot about allyship broadly now on campuses, and we learn a lot about allyship in other areas. But first, they have to learn how to identify anti-Semitism, how to feel confident they know what it is, how to understand the dangers of it. And so I think any serious action, education is fundamental to that.
David, did you want to say anything, or should I move on?
I mean, you know, I'm an academic, so I'm always happy to say something, but I think I don't need to in
Okay.
this circumstance. So.
Okay. So I'll move on to two other questions, and then we can get to more. One is, are there any of the panelists who are also working on public K-12 partnerships or increasing Jewish and anti-Semitism education on high school campuses? So that's one thing to think about. And the second is, do any of the campuses represent here use the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism as a guideline for their efforts to confront anti-Semitism on campus? So part of it is definitions and how you use them as a guide, or not, and why. And one is K-12 partnerships. So that's just something that Amy and I were talking about with one of our colleagues in Madison, who's a middle schooler, had dealt with anti-Semitism, asking us, what is available for K-12. So yeah, so if you could, and then we'll get to the next questions, if you, any of you who'd like to address either or both of those questions.
I'm not doing anything on that directly, again, other than being a relatively public-facing figure who talks and writes about these issues, so that, and I have gotten periodically, not about anti-Semitism yet, but every once in a while, an enterprising Portland high school student will reach out and be like, I'm doing a project on such and such, and I saw that you did a little bit on it. Could we talk? Always happy to do that, right? And again, so I agree with what Ethan said before about that there's sort of a false dichotomy between action and education, right? Because you need to know what to do before you do it, right? And I think, again, we see sometimes the sort of like, we have to do something, and this is something, so therefore we have to do it, without really all that much thought into whether it's justifiable, whether it makes sense, whether it's counterproductive, it's just the sort of, act for the sake of acting, and pat yourself on the back for that. I think, people understanding, what anti-Semitism is. Yes, it's not enough if they sort of like are able to like fill in a bubble on a test, and never, for lack of a better word, apply it in practice. But having the sort of confidence, and resources, cognitive and otherwise, at one's disposal to be able to like identify this is not okay, and in our peer group, in our community, this is not going to get you somewhere, right? This, acting in this way, talking in this way, is not going to be acceptable. I think in a lot of ways that action, when you can do it, is far more powerful than any sort of certification, but also or even any sort of like highly punitive response. What you just need is the ambient atmosphere of a community that knows that what this anti-Semitism is, knows that it's not okay, and is able to create an atmosphere where if there is an incident, it is clearly identified as that person is the outlier, and the Jews in our community, we have their backs.
I can jump in. We're now exploring what we could be doing with K-12 schools. One of the benefits of being able to hire somebody full-time as a program director is that, Bright Drinkwater already sort of trying to plug in and see if there's a place for us in those conversations. And there's certainly a real paucity of resources for a lot of those educators. So I think we should all be thinking about, to the extent possible, that we can be helpful there. But we have limited bandwidth. And part of what we need is to be able to have, yes, faculty, critically need to be in these conversations, but I think to the extent possible to have staff positions dedicated to thinking about anti-Semitism education on and beyond our campuses, it allows us to really expand what we're doing. On the issue of definitions, our campus did not adopt the IHRA definition. My position on definitions is pretty well articulated in the guidelines created by the task force that I've co-chaired for the AJS, which is to say that we have three major definitions that have been discussed a lot: the IHRA, the Jerusalem Declaration, and the Nexus document. I have my own views about those, but the bottom line is I think they're all valuable. The Venn diagram where they intersect is actually very large, and that's lost in the debates over definitions, but they're all tools. When people try to use them as speech codes or as checklists that will prove if you are or are not anti-Semitic, they become mechanistic and they become very problematic. And so the IHRA definition, it's by far most problematic through its misuse rather than through most of the words in the definition or the examples themselves. And the other definitions are also open to abuse, depending on people's motivations and the way they try to, turn their words. So I think that campuses should be using them as useful guidelines, but I think that this push to kind of have some, official adoption of the definition that's going to then shape what you define as in or out is really problematic. And one of the reasons that I think gets lost is not only are things being shoehorned into anti-Semitism that are just not justifiably called anti-Semitic by an empirical standard, but just as problematic, once we're obsessed about definitions, anything that is not anti-Semitic under those definitions by implication is just fine. And that's not the case. I mean, people can be harassed disproportionately because of their attachment to Israel. And you might conclude at the end of the day, well, this is really about hostility to Israel and it's not about hostility to Jews. So I'm not going to call it anti-Semitism, but we would not tolerate it for people connected to other, countries outside of the United States. But somehow, because we're so focused on is it or is it not anti-Semitism, we forget that, right? So what we've tried to focus on more and more is how does this affect the climate for Jewish students on our campus? What are reasonable things to expect in terms of trying to create a climate where students feel physically safe and comfortable being their whole selves? Again, they should be challenged. They can be challenged on their ideas. That's part of education. It should be part of education. I take Rob Eschman's point in his story the other day about Zionist snowflakes, which I think was a really, he had important points there. But what's reasonable to expect in terms of a climate where Jewish students feel safe? And that's where we want our focus to be. And I think the war over definitions actually gets us farther from that focus.
Yeah, I'm going to ask kind of a last question from Lauren Harris, and then all of you, including David, if you also want to address the definitions. I know you've done a great job about looking at the intersection of definitions, and we at MSU had a similar stance as you did, Ethan, to basically use all the definitions or piece of definitions that wanted as a guide, but going much beyond that and a greater length of that to actually explain and also address inclusion. So there'll be time for kind of all of you to make closing comments to address those previous questions, but I also wanted you to address this final question from Lauren Harris, and I'll just read it to you. It says, this may already be part of the courses you all teach, but if not, I think it should be. The focus on the history of anti-Semitism in America is of course critical, but I think there also should be emphasis on philo-Semitism, beginning with George Washington's being the first head of a modern state to openly acknowledge the Jews as full-fledged citizens of the land, which they had chosen to settle. This is the theme of Fritz Hirschfeld's book, George Washington and the Jews. How many Americans know this, and how many are even dimly aware of the extraordinary contributions the Jews have made to American culture? We should be trying to stamp out anti-Semitism and stamp in philo-Semitism. So this, I know, could be, people can have different opinions about this, but I wanted to kind of finish up, have closing remarks, but also maybe address kind of issues of philo-Semitism and when perhaps that can even be anti-Semitism, or when that can be actually something that some of you have talked about, and Avi as well, and we've thought about in terms of our presentation to the RAs just last week, if we're focusing on kind of all these negative things, essentially when we're talking about anti-Semitism, do we need a little more positive things in there as well? And perhaps that's also what Lauren Harris was referring to. So maybe if all of you can kind of address anything else, any closing remarks you have, because I know it's kind of late in the day, at least here in Michigan, in the evening, it's been a long day for many of you. So anyway, if you could address that last question and any other things that you'd like to address in your closing remarks.
I'll start. So I'll just, try to sort of encapsulate a number of the different things that have been brought up and in terms of closing remarks. So, I can't summarize any better than Ethan did about the definitions. And I'll just say that, I love your sort of point about kind of taking the Venn diagram of the three definitions and sort of focusing on the points of agreement. And what we do in the class is essentially present all of them and say, like, there are various different definitions. And especially when we get to the class about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, that's where we say, like, this is why we might see some difference between these different definitions, but also raise that point which you alluded to, whereas if there's a disproportionate focus on someone, because of their Jewish identity and targeting them for the deeds of the Israeli government or critique of Israel because of their Jewish identity, we point out, right, like that is a case where it sort of becomes anti-Semitic, and not to mention sort of demonizing the Jewish state or engaging in forms of Holocaust. Now, there's all sorts of ways in which it becomes very easy to talk about anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism. But I do also want to mention this question about K through 12 education and say something about that, because, I do believe very strongly in, as a, working at a state university, we've been very much involved in efforts to push legislation, for example, to require Holocaust and genocide education in the state of Connecticut, which took place in 2018. But now we're trying to help to develop resources. But as I've also said, I'm also want to caution about just teaching about anti-Semitism through the lens of Holocaust education. And so this is a point where I think, for example, some of you might be familiar with the documentary, which was on PBS on the US and the Holocaust, where Ken Burns very specifically wanted to focus on, yes, I'm going to teach about the history of the Holocaust, but through an American lens, to talk about sort of American responses, American anti-Semitism within the context of that. And so I think one of the things that we will try to do in terms of, we have a law that requires Holocaust education in the state of Connecticut. We don't have a law that, that necessarily specifically, I think, that might be moving forward, but we do have this. But to teach about a broader American context of sort of American responses to the refugee crisis, that's something that we teach about in the class. Why was the United States basically closed off to refugees? It's a really important part of the history that we want students to understand. And at the same time, I think to the last point about American history, yes, we also want to teach about why America for long stretches of time has been a very successful place, one of the largest, probably perhaps the most successful diaspora Jewish community in history. And part of that has to do with an ideal that's expressed by George Washington, this idea of, a government which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, right? We have this ideal that we should be living up to, but we can also teach our students that in many cases in our history, we have not lived up to that ideal. It doesn't mean we can't accomplish it, but it's a goal for us to live up to. And we are, I would hope, this responds also to the question about education and confronting. We've had preliminary conversations to engage students who have taken this class in doing education on the K through 12 level. So taking what they've learned and then teaching students in the community on be it in religious school programs or Hebrew school programs or in other schools about what they've learned, right? So taking it, and perhaps the best way to internalize what you've learned is having to teach it to someone else. So that is something that we're trying to do as well.
Ethan, you want to go?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to encapsulate sort of what's been a really wide-ranging and rich discussion. let me go to the question first, and then maybe I'll expand a little bit out from there. I'm wary about philo-Semitism as a good way of dealing with these issues, because a lot's been written about how philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism are often two sides of the same coin. But what I think that question alludes to that is really important that Yael was getting at is we do not want our education about the Jewish experience to be singularly focused on anti-Semitism. And it's very easy to fall into that, what I think is a kind of trap. And it's problematic on so many levels. And I think it's both less effective and ends up giving a really skewed picture in a lot of ways. When we do our trainings, we always start by talking about some of the basics about Judaism and Jews and Jewish culture. And the fact is, I think what we really want is for our campuses to be places where Jews and Jewish culture are considered part of the multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural fabric, and that they're celebrated like other cultures. And that we're also then aware that, like many other groups, Jews face challenges, histories, and contemporary challenges of persecution. So I think that it's really important. My friend Deborah Lipstadt sometimes says when she's meeting with students, don't let this define you. Right? Don't let this be the only thing that you think about in terms of your Jewishness. And it's such an important point, and I think it can't be emphasized enough with our students who are sometimes facing these challenges and they are exhausted by them, right? So I think that if I have to sort of, sum up what I hope people can take from our discussion, at least one of the big things is that I think what we are really starving for right now, and I'm pleased to be on a panel with Avi and David, who I know are working for this on their own campuses, is an honest conversation that is acknowledging the seriousness of anti-Semitism as an issue on our campuses, and that is simultaneously really upholding the value of education and academic freedom in a robust way, right? The fact is, we will not solve these problems by either minimizing them, or on the other hand, by trying to basically prescribe what anyone is allowed to say about any Jewish subject, particularly Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? We have to actually open spaces for honest conversation, and we have to, I think, acknowledge the real problems that Jewish students are facing and the ways that they're often parallel to the challenges of other groups. And at the same time, the fact that conversations around Israel-Palestine involve lots of dynamics. And if we're not careful, Palestinian students can be disadvantaged and face discrimination in those conversations. So what I really think that we need is to invest in this kind of conversation-driven and nuanced approach. And if we as educators and as experts are not willing to invest in that approach, honestly, it's difficult to expect administrators or community members to support it. So I'm really appreciative of the opportunity here, and thanks to MSU for hosting what I think is a really nuanced conversation to open us in these ways.
Yeah. First of all, on Lauren's question, I want to echo both what Ethan said and Ethan's caveat, which is that I think what the question generally is getting at, and I agree this is very important, is to sort of avoid the lachrymose form of Jewish history where we're only talking about the bad and the miserable. There are a lot of cool things about being Jewish, right? We should talk about them. Right. I had a colleague who said, like, her and her son, they just moved to Lewis and Clark. They didn't really know many Jews. She knew that I was Jewish. She's like, what's a book I can read? We were curious. We want to know a book. I'm not going to give her the Diary of Anne Frank. Right? It's a great book, but not for this. Right. We need other things. And I also share Ethan's twitchiness about philo-Semitism. Right. I love what Disraeli said that about Jews being a nervous people because centuries of Christian love have frayed our nerves. Right. So, there are downsides to being loved. I might settle for being liked or respected. Right. So those will do for me. I do want to talk about the definition point. Ethan was very, very generous in saying there are three major definitions. I'm one of the drafters actually of the Nexus definition, which is, of those three, the one you haven't heard of. because I think IRA is by far the most prominent, and then the Jerusalem Declaration is the main response and antagonist to IRA. And a lot of people, you sort of, if you're aligned with the sort of mainline Jewish community, you tend to like IRA. And if you're kind of on the insurgent side of the equation, you really are averse to what to what's happening there. You can probably like JDA. And Nexus, I like to think take some, a modest, more middle ground. I think it's really great. I think it's, kind of is trying to avoid being conscripted into, again, one of these ideological warfares. And for all of those reasons, nobody pays any attention to it. So it's very nice that Ethan puts us in the big three. But one thing I want to say about all the definitions is that, and obviously I have my favorite, but I certainly agree that we can't have, we can say we can't ban speech, right? That we have a First Amendment or our equivalents of it in terms of academic freedom at colleges and universities. However, right, one thing that has I think permeated a lot of the debates about the definition is this desire to kind of avoid controversy, to be authoritative and say like these are incontestable cases of anti-Semitism. And then if they're not incontestable, then it's inappropriate for them to be labeled anti-Semitic, right? And for speech, that where they say we have to be really concerned about, that this might be a legitimate statement and therefore not an anti-Semitic statement. Any articulation of anti-Semitism or fight against anti-Semitism worth its salt has to sometimes put its foot down and say this thing that a lot of people believe and a lot of people defend passionately and a lot of people really want to say nonetheless is anti-Semitic, right? We can't be that faint-hearted about it, right? Anti-Semitism definitions, our practices, our trainings, our programs are useless if they only deal with uncontested cases, right? And everybody already agrees it's anti-Semitic. We don't have need for a definition or a training or a program to tell us that, right? These things have critical bite in circumstances where there is a fight about it, right? And there has to be some willingness to stand one's ground. And so I have, quite a few problems with the IRA definition in terms of it, I think, just being impossibly vague in a lot of areas. But like some of the objection to it is that IRA is wrong because it calls things anti-Semitic that people I like say. I'm like, that's not a good enough reason to oppose something, right? And so it's going to require some degree of courage in terms of saying like anti-Semitism exists and is real and is significant in discourses and in communities and in practices that we care about and that we like and that we're sympathetic to. And then from there, we can say things like, we can talk about degrees of culpability. We can say that not all forms of anti-Semitism are, the equivalent of being the next Hitler, right? There are levels to this game, right? And there are different things and we can talk about them differently. But the idea that if something is currently politically contested, it is ipso facto not a valid candidate to be called anti-Semitic, I think cannot hold, right? And that applies to speech too, right? Regardless of whether we say the right move is to ban the speech, and I agree in most circumstances it isn't, right? Speech can be anti-Semitic, right? There can be anti-Semitic speech that might be constitutionally protected, but nonetheless anti-Semitic speech, right? Whether IRA or Nexus or JDA strikes the right line, we can obviously have that discussion. But I think there are dangers of false positives, but there's dangers of false negatives too. And it's not a party foul just because anti-Semitism is alleged in a situation where some people who have letters after their name and prominent positions want to say that it isn't. The last thing I'm going to say, I'm just going to take this opportunity that Yael gave me to just, I've mentioned it before, but give the official plug for the conference that we're putting on at Lewis and Clark on law versus anti-Semitism, and maybe Ariana can put the link back in the chat for that one. But we're hosting it on March 26th through 27th. It's an in-person conference. We have about 40 presenters from 5 countries coming. We're really excited about it, and we really would love anybody who's interested. It's an name notwithstanding, it is an interdisciplinary conference. We've got a lot of different not just academic departments, but for lack of a better word, practitioners in the field, from the Anti-Defamation League, from anti-racism organizations, from the Oregon Jewish Museum, and we think it's going to be a really great conference. And anybody who wants to visit Portland in the springtime, where it's a lovely city, we would very much love to have you. And I'm happy to, if you want to reach out to me, answer any questions you might have about that.
Thank you so much to all three of you. It's been a really interesting and helpful discussion. We've, spent so many hours thinking about these subjects, especially over the last 6 years. So it's great to get your insights. I don't know, Kirsten and Amy, if you'd like to have any closing thoughts or anything like that, because I know you've put your lifetimes into these issues as well.
I'll just say one thing, which is that I agree entirely with in this discussion about definitions. And I'll say that's exactly how we came to the solution that we came to create a guide on anti-Semitism, which was a lot more struggle and kind of blood, sweat, and tears than we anticipated, because it's true that a guideline in a sheet or 2 pages perhaps cannot possibly get at the complexity of what anti-Semitism is. And so, we created, how long is the document? 11 pages?
Or maybe 14 with
14.
resources.
I mean,
and
it started with
reading.
like 30,
Yeah.
and then, we wanted it to be manageable. We wanted people to be able to look at it and actually use it instead of, just throwing it out because it was so big. But that was our response, right? That we had our own situation where some students tried to pass IRA, and there was a really, by all accounts, anti-Semitic backlash. And so the question was, how do we support those students? And so our solution was to get away from the definitions altogether and to create something more educational. And so that's what I wanted to say too, right? That's been the other underlying theme. We are academics, we do education, and also coming from the perspective that most, we know from teaching our students, most are just not very well educated, A, on Jewish history, B, on anti-Semitism, and C, on Israel-Palestine, right? They have their talking points, but they don't know. And so that was a big part of it too, just trying to meet students where we think most of them are, which is probably naive and ignorant, and building from there rather than assuming they're all hostile or, and that's not what we see in our students and in our classes. And so providing, an educational resource was really important for us, that we also thought would be a way to support our Jewish students who were coming to us, right, with these experiences of hostility that they experienced. So.
And I would just piggyback on that to say, and this is also to get into an earlier conversation slightly about action versus education, right? Which is that, for us, we really did feel as though, educating was, was a form of action for us, certainly, and that it really helped students. And this is just talking a little bit about what David said about diversity and following up on Amy's point. There's a big diversity among universities, and among students, right? So the students that I have, frequently come in with no talking points at all. So just simply to just talk about Jews is something they have literally never done, never talked about Israel. There's huge diversity on college campuses, which is to recognize that really meeting everybody and giving people a little bit of information about who Jews are, and what these tropes are, how they've been understood. To me, like that is kind of a very base level that in a lot of places, in a lot of circumstances, not all of them, right? But recognizing that diversity, sometimes that really is enough, not enough, but it is really an important first step. And that's what I really feel like we were able to do. And what I feel like a lot of this is able to do. And I just want to thank everybody, because this has been just really a really fantastic conversation. And I'm sorry we couldn't do it more, because I heard so much from all of you that just really resonated with what I wanted to say. So just thank you all for being here.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're all kind of working much more on these issues than we had ever anticipated a few years ago, and it's absorbing more of our lives. And I think it's really helpful for us to continue these conversations together into the future and learn from each other. I also wanted to thank Ariana. I don't know if you had any closing comments, but Ariana is being an integral part of our efforts on campus and was an assistant director of the ADL in Michigan. So I don't know, I don't want you to put me on the spot, Ariana, but if you'd like to share any thoughts, you're welcome to.
You're so kind. My only thought was that everyone's perspective here was so valuable, and thank you so much for your participation.
Okay, well, thanks to everyone who, since we kind of ran late, for hanging in there with us, and I know there'll be a lot more people watching the recording of this in the next few weeks. So thank you so much, and we look forward to sharing ideas in the future with you. Kirsten?
I just want to say thank you to you, Yael, because this was really Yael's brainchild as well. So thank you very much for putting it all together.
Well, thanks to everyone. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and hopefully the future will get better, and all these efforts will just be just kind of prevention and kind of learning more positive things as well, and it won't be as much of a national kind of and campus crisis in the future. But we look forward to future dialogues, and we really appreciate the time that you took with us, and thank you for those who attended. Thank you.